momentum. Signals remain bearish for the NASDAQ and S&P 500. I still think you're going to likely attempt some kind of rebound at some point. My guess is we go lower first. We'll see what happens. Signals remain bearish. There's no guarantee that we go back up and fill the gap immediately. Stochastic's trying to turn back up here, but again, could remain at extremes for an extended period of time. I'm going to be watching, does the awesome oscillator here begin to tick back up and we bottom out, or does it start going negative, more likely going negative, and then turn back up and confirm a lower high, maybe surrounding earnings or the Fed, if we bottom out surrounding the gap fill and our 20 or 50 period moving average is just beyond the 50 period. So I think we get another push down, and then I think we can try to bottom out. We'll see what happens, but the signals do remain bearish. Again, could end up forming a confirmation of a lower high or a divergence if we try to move to a higher high. But NASDAQ, like I said, very well may have topped. Nvidia has topped. I think you got a good chance that Nvidia has topped. Bearish divergence on the weekly chart. So we'll be watching. I think that's probably going to go negative. Then again, we'll see if it recycles back up. S&P may or may not go negative with that. But again, you got red bars, you got a red cloud, you're holding below the 10 period, you got the red dots of resistance. The 10 is about to cross below the 20. That will likely happen tomorrow here on the NASDAQ. Again, the divergence is playing out on NASDAQ. We got the bearish evening stars I talked about. Weekly time frame, you have the 9 count with that formation, with that bar right there, as I've talked about here this video and previously. We're getting the red bar with the awesome oscillator. Oftentimes you get these red bars and you'll attempt a recovery. And again, maybe we try to bounce, go below the 10 week, but then try to rebound back above it. We'll see what happens. We'll see if we attempt a bigger rebound, either immediately at horizontal support or get another push down. My guess is we'll probably get another push down, but my signals remain bearish. Again, we could see an attempted recovery at some point. Sometimes you get the red bars and you just see the bottom fall out. The market. Sometimes you attempt a recovery. It happens with both of those scenarios. With the S&P, again, we've got the red bar, S&P in the weekly time frame, nowhere near the 10 week. Again, if we drop down a little bit further, I think that we can still rebound back up, even do it before the weekends if we sell off Wednesday, Thursday, but rebound maybe with the inflation data on Friday, earnings or whatever. But again, you got the red bar, the divergences are completing here. Again, we'll see if we get a rebound. And again, do we attempt to make a new high with the Fed or with earnings to fill that gap on the S&P? Or do we get a gap and go and we just keep going down? We're going to go back and try to fill these gaps, but my signals remain bearish. Please support the channel with the link directly below. That allows me to be able to provide you this information. The chart, you like the indicators, let me know that by supporting the channel. Take a moment to do that. I would really appreciate it. I don't have any sponsors. I turn all those offers down because I don't want to end up selling you a bunch of stuff. I do need your help in order to make it work. Take a moment, step up to the plate and help out. I would really, really appreciate that. Follow the link below and it'll take you to a secured site. You can donate any amount you want. I thank you for your consideration for that. The S&P 500 daily chart. Again, we've got a bearish reversal of conditions. You see the little red arrow, the red cloud, the red bars. Again, as long as this remains bearish, we can go a whole lot lower. Okay? Start seeing a gap and go and just start moving down sharply towards the 4,900 area towards the 200 period without any kind of gap fill at all. That's why I'm telling you there's no guarantee that we do it. But could we do it? Yeah. I think the odds probably favor it. But again, as long as we hold below the 10 period moving average, as long as the signals are bearish, we can end up going a whole lot lower. Trend signals are bearish. Momentum signals are bearish. Here, again, I'll be watching, do we get red bars? Do we end up turning back up and getting a divergence surrounding the Fed or earnings? Could be. Or, do we go a little bit lower or higher low to fill the gap and then try to turn back up? I think it could play out that way. But be watching. We could still see negative bars. The bars go red, negative territory, and then turn back up like I was talking about with NASDAQ. But again, the signals are bearish. See if they remain that way. Bigger drop right here, or do we attempt a recovery and to bottom out, to carve out a short-term bottom to attempt to fill those gaps or not? Watch a gap. Is it a gap and go, a gap and fill, or a gap and trap? So far, we have a gap and go with those gaps lower. We'll see what happens if we go back and try to fill them. Wouldn't be surprised to eventually see more green here, either going negative with the awesome oscillator and then turning back up, or just staying in positive territory and having the bars flip from red back to green. My signals remain bearish. Here is the S&P 500. And again, the momentum line is bearish. Momentum signals are bearish. Trend signals are starting to have turned bearish here with the cloud. This line represents a bigger swing move. We may move down to it, move to a new low, but try to bounce off of that. And then the 100 period down here, we have everything bearish and momentum validating it by going into the negative region. It still may be. Momentum and other signals begin to form a divergence in the daily time frame. We already had a divergence right here that gave us the sell-off. We may end up forming a larger divergence on the S&P if we go back up and eventually fill that gap. I think there's a good chance that happens surrounding earnings or the Fed. Could still get another leg lower. The gray shaded area behind price is telling us something big is getting ready to happen. Now maybe we go down and go back up and it still is forming and we end up getting a bigger drop going back up, forming a triple negative divergence. Certainly possible, or going a little bit lower and forming a triple divergence, again, surrounding the Fed or earnings. For now, signals remain bearish. On the daily chart for the S&P, warned you before the sell-off happened that we had warning signs that we were going to get a turn, and then that was validated with the trend signals turning bearish, momentum flipping with the momentum line there. Same thing with NASDAQ. Signals remain bearish. They were confirmed with momentum going negative. We had this negative divergence. I warned you about that on several different indicators that had formed. We had these warning signs up at top right here, and then we saw momentum flip right after that. I warned you we were going to go up, and we were going to, after that 500-point drop, we were going to go up, and we were going to get a lower high in the golden pocket, likely up to 78.6 Fibonacci. We hit it right on the nose, and this happened right after that. We've dropped 5.67% so far on the NASDAQ. Could continue to drop. Says we're probably going to try to come down a little bit lower, get another leg down, get a 5-leg push lower, and then attempt a recovery. We'll see what happens, but if the signals remain bearish, we could just continue to move into a free fall. We'll see which way it plays out. My guess is that we'll probably get a rebound, but we don't have to fill those gaps. But signals remain bearish. Again, the shaded area is telling us something big is getting ready to happen. Again, we'll probably get some kind of rebound back up and continue, and then again go lower, come back up and fill the gap, and then start seeing a much bigger summer sell-off, which is what I think is going to likely be the case. I told you back up here at the top that again the NASDAQ was forming negative divergences and topping signals. Bitcoin was forming bottoming signals. Bitcoin bounced. I predicted a huge bounce for Bitcoin. It did happen. And I predicted that the NASDAQ signals here were going to play out and the divergences, and that happened. If they remain bearish here, my guess is we get another leg down and then attempt a recovery to fill the gap, as I've said. 20,400. Again, the VIX is staying above the 200 period moving average. We tested it today and bounced out the 10 period. Again, if we start getting a bigger sell-off, we could stay above the 200 and signals will just remain bearish. But if we get another leg down and we try to bottom out, eventually we can come back towards the 50 and towards the breakout here with the trend line on the VIX. If we do that, we may attempt to recover and try to fill those gaps. If we just continue to soar, then again, we can get a much bigger sell-off. You start dropping below the 200 period moving average, then we might see a recovery. It still may be, again, that the VIX is not done. We go up here and still end up getting something like that if the S&P and NASDAQ go to a new low towards their 50-period moving averages. S&P might move towards it. NASDAQ might move beyond it. Things to be paying attention to. The S&P, like NASDAQ, it may move towards the 50. It may move just above it if we go down to a lower level, hit horizontal support, may move towards it or tag it. NASDAQ will probably move beyond it if we get another leg down, but S&P still may come back up here and form a triple negative divergence. We have the divergence right here give us a sell-off. It still may be that we go back up and fill this gap and move to new high. The gap happened right at the top, so good chance S&P is going to fill that gap at some point when NASDAQ goes back up and fill the gap. The thing, though, NASDAQ has likely peaked. If Nvidia has, S&P, if we go down, could go one more leg up, and the head formation can complete over here rather than right here, and then we could see the bigger sell-off. So keep that in mind. If the signals start turning back to bullish, my guess is that's going to be the case. You could form a divergence on the MACD, which also moved to a new high like some of the indicators in the daily time frame. So I think you can form a divergence there. And again, get the oscillator turning back up and forming a divergence as well. Again, signals continue to be bearish. We're in the heart of earnings. We've got the Fed meeting coming up. We've got economic data. The Dow was down 57 points. The S&P was down 8.67 points, down 0.16%. NASDAQ was flat, down about 10 points. Russell was up 1%. The VIX was down 1.27%, just under 15. We had Alphabet and Tesla in after hours. Alphabet beat on earnings and revenue. They were down on some ad revenue. In after hours, they are up 0.85%. They're up $1, $1.26, $1.40 now. Tesla's down 3.25% in after hours. Dropped 2% during the session. We're going to get more earnings, a lot of earnings this week and next week, a lot of S&P 500 companies, some of the big tech names, and then we'll get more big tech names next. Let me just bring up the earnings calendar. We just had Alphabet and Tesla after the bell. Again, we'll get more important earnings. We'll have IBM after the bell on Wednesday, other important earnings, and then important tech names next week. Nevertheless, I digress. On Thursday, we're going to get the GDP before the market opens. Eventually, you're going to see a negative number. I think that either this quarter we can get it or the next quarter. Even if they come in positive, the revision, it could be eventually revised down to a negative number. But I think we will see it going forward. I think you'll see the first negative quarter of GDP either this quarter for the second quarter or for the next report that we get for the following quarter. The PCE inflation data, again, we'll be watching that. Come in line, or is it a miss? Next week we get the Fed. July 31st on Wednesday we get the Fed announcement. Press conference, again, I think on September 18th they will begin the pivot. So I think that we'll see a topping process. Of that, I think we're in it right now. NASDAQ very well could have peaked if we've seen at the top with Nvidia, the semiconductors. We're going to go back up and get a bigger rally at some point. We'll have the jobs report next Friday, a week from this coming Friday. Nvidia got a doji candle indecision, same candlestick on the NASDAQ. We went back up on Nvidia to fill this gap on an intraday basis, but we failed to reach the close. Still do that, but if we get one more push down, I think the NASDAQ will form bullish divergence, another reference point of a bullish divergence, triple bullish divergence on the 60-minute chart. Futures will do the same thing. It's suggesting that I think NASDAQ will go down to the 50 and Nvidia will probably overthrow it here. And then I think we'll likely get a bigger rebound back up. But I think Nvidia has likely peaked on June 20th. Again, I talked about that reversal bar at the time. I talked about this reversal bar with the lower high. Talked about the divergence on the semiconductors, the Bollinger Bands and the bearish engulfing back to back at the same place here that we got it with Nvidia. Again, I think Nvidia is eventually going to head down and get a summer sell-off, bottom out, begin to rally ahead of September 18th for a Fed pivot. That's what I think is going to happen. If you do, you've got this massive head and shoulders, and the S&P and NASDAQ could be setting up the same pattern. NASDAQ very well could have peaked if Nvidia has, and the semiconductors are still out on the S&P. It gapped right at the highs. NASDAQ and NASDAQ and Nvidia gapped after a lower high had set up. So again, very good chance NASDAQ stops making new highs. This is what I think is going on for Nvidia, and if it is, then NASDAQ should sell off as well. Going back, its horizontal support, it would be 75 here on Nvidia, and then I think you've got a shot at a head and shoulders on both. I warned you, my 10th, about this 9 count again. Count, you either turn immediately or you go a little higher and you turn, and it's telling us we're either getting a pullback or a reversal. If the NASDAQ daily chart here has topped, it is a reversal. The gap will likely be filled at some point. This is we're going to probably get another push down and then make an attempt to do that. I told you at that time, the few sessions leading up into the reversal bar, the signals were warning we were going to get a turn. I warned you that my Bitcoin signals were forming warning sign that a bottom was developing, that Bitcoin would rally big and the market would begin to sell off. NASDAQ dropped, Bitcoin soared, my signals were right. Now, we got a 9 count. today on the NASDAQ daily chart. It is not a perfected signal. It will be because bar 7 is the low of the count. It will be if we push down below bar 7. I think we're likely going to do that. Again, we got a little doji here in the form of a little topping tail, and again, similar to the candlestick on Nvidia. Nvidia had a bigger rebound up. NASDAQ did not come up here to fill the gap on an intraday basis or on a closing basis at all. It didn't even get near it. Likely happen in the future, but we could come back and try to fill the gap right here and get one more leg down. I think you have a 5-leg push down going on. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think this is wave 4. I think you're about to get 5, and then I think you're going to get an ABC move up. And again, down here with this gap fill is where a 50-period moving average is hovering. We'll probably overthrow the 50-period moving average to fill the gap. Then I think you can bottom, okay, and get a short-term bottom. But there's a very good chance the top is in. I talked about it back at the time with this 9 count. I talked about it with the signals. So much complacency all over the internet. And again, signals are now playing out. You've got a possible, as I've said, a possible head and shoulders with a horizontal neckline here. If we can get the traction up, my guess is that we'll probably break down and then go back up. Maybe you have a slanted neckline. Maybe you come back up and you get a bottoming tail, and you come back up and you close at this level and you get a hammer or something like that, a bottoming tail or a doji. That works out. But again, I do think we're going to get one more push down. In all likelihood, my signals remain bearish. I expect that this pattern will probably be confirmed and get a perfected buy signal once we close below this level or push on an intraday basis below that level. And then I think is what will happen, we'll attempt to move up to fill the gap. Quickly, in the weekly time frame, I warned you about the double sequence count sell signal 3.5 weeks ago. I warned you about this. You actually, even before, as it was setting up with bar 7 and 8, I warned you about this. Again, sometimes you go a little higher and then you turn. Other times you turn immediately. We went just a little bit higher. We got that topping tail. I warned you when the topping tail that we could have a 3-week evening doji star. 9 count reversal in the candle pattern here, and that did play out. I told you we could get a big red bar like we had a big green bar here and have a 3-week reversal. Again, eventually I think we're going to get a larger counter trend to fill the gap, but then ultimately head down towards the 17,000 area on the NASDAQ, and you have a very large head and shoulders that I think is under construction here in the weekly time frame. That played out beautifully with the divergences. NASDAQ weekly chart here. 100 was down 68 points, 0.35% today. Again, I warned you about those diversions back at the top with that 9 count was forming. And again, followed by that bearish reversal bar, that red bar, and we dropped 500 points. I told you we can get a rally back up to the golden pocket, and I talked about the 78.6 Fibonacci getting a lower high and then more selling. Played out exactly that way. Continue to have our sell signals. We continue to go lower. I'll be watching the 50 and this gap fill, as I spoke about. Watching to see if we fill this gap. We don't have to fill this gap, but we very well could. S&P gapped at the very top. It still could go to a new high, and we could fill this gap on NASDAQ, but I think we're going to push down to the 50 period first. We'll be watching, again, gap fill and the 50 period moving average. MACD, again, turned down, still in positive territory. Eventually, whether we fill the gap immediately or whether we just have a gap and go, eventually I think we're headed down to the 17,000 area and the 200 period for a test. We get a slanted neckline. Maybe we overthrow the 200 like Bitcoin did, and we can hit horizontal support. But that's why I think we're going to get a summer sell-off, a rally back into September 18th. Just beyond that, talked about the pivot is bearish. This pattern very well could set up on the NASDAQ, and it could be topping. Talked about the bearish signals, 9 count, the divergence on the RSI, and the divergence with momentum here. And again, we broke down from this rising wedge, gapping lower. I told you we get a lower high and then begin to break down. That's exactly the way it played out. Now we're getting this bounce off horizontal support. Again, I think you're probably going to move beyond the 50-period moving average to fill the gap here. The gap fills at 19,000 to 210. That's where I think we're likely headed, to this low 19,000 area, and then I think we're going to bounce back up and we're going to move towards 20,400 here to fill this gap. That's what I think is likely going to be the case. So I think we'll probably see something like this, where we come back down here and get a lower high, and S&P could end up getting a higher high to fill its gap. The gap here, we got it with a lower high, just like Nvidia. The S&P got it at the very top, so still could see a new high on the S&P. See this surrounding the Fed or with earnings, but this is what I think is happening, and I think we'll end up getting a somersault. There's no guarantee we do this. Again, my signals remain bearish that we fill the gap right here, right now. If we get a push lower and then go back, there's no guarantee we do it. Do it at a much later date if we have a gap and go. Just gap down and just keep going. But my guess is you're going to make an attempt to fill that gap. I think you're going to get one more push down for a 5-leg push lower, as I've talked about, but eventually make our way back down here. Talked about a 5-leg push lower. Here it is on the 60-minute chart. We had this bullish divergence right here. That's given us this rally and the gap higher. We're probably going to go back and fill the gap over the next 2 sessions. Probably come back down and fill this gap over here. And I think you'll bottom in this 19,200 area. Okay, or in the low 19,000 area somewhere, and then I think we'll make a move to come back up here and try to fill a gap at the 20,400 area. But I think when this divergence finishes, you'll have a bottom on your hands for the NASDAQ for the short term. You got a pretty good shot that the top is in on the NASDAQ with this divergence over here, the bearish divergence. So again, I'll be watching. My guess is this triple bullish divergence is going to form, and again, create a short-term bottom for the NASDAQ. I think the MACD will roll over here, and the MACD will get also a triple bullish divergence. We had a little one right here, again with these lows, and I think the MACD will roll over here in the next 2 sessions and likely get that. We can sell off into the PCE data later in the week or earnings or whatever, but I think that this scenario has a good shot of playing out on the NASDAQ. So again, possible head and shoulders here if we bounce right here and that holds. But my guess is we still may have a head and shoulders, but it may be a lopsided neckline, or like I said, you may get a bottoming tail down in here somewhere. We'll see how it unfolds. But again, for triple bullish divergence, and I think that will likely create some type of tradable bottom here for the NASDAQ. And I think that there'll be short covering there, taking profits, and I think the buy the dip crowd will come in, and I think people will be flipping the trade, expecting NASDAQ to come back up here. No guarantee it does, but if these bullish divergences form, could get a bounce, could get a reversal to take us back up here to try to fill the gap. My guess is you'll try to get a reversal of this and get an ABC move, back up an ABC move that will take us back up, and again, for a lower high and to be followed by a much, much bigger sell-off. Speculation on my part that will fill the gap immediately. No guarantee we do that, as I've said, but I think we are going to turn down here. Remain bearish. I told you I expected the momentum to likely roll over today when the counter trend was done. That happened. We talked about that. So we got that rollover today. We had the rally. The rally fizzled out, ended up being down. We stalled at the 200 here on the 60-minute chart. Again, tried to bounce off of horizontal support. We broke the trend line, got back above it. I think we're coming down to fill this gap down here. I think you get one more push down, and then you get a tradable bottom. This is suggesting that we're going to sell off with the scenario that I've been talking about, down to fill this gap and getting one more leg down in a 5-leg push lower. So I think we will get a bottom. The trend line broke. If we bottom out and get back above it, again, we can redraw the channel. Trend lines change all the time. Channels change. Again, here I've got this potential head and shoulders pattern. My guess is we're going to get another leg down. And momentum turning down during the last part of the trading session there. NASDAQ 60-minute chart. So I think we will see a death cross here in the 60-minute time frame of the 50, the green line here, and the 200, and I think we'll get it before the weekends here. But I think you're going to get another push down, potentially a rebound, possible head and shoulders here. Could still be forming the head formation, and again, it could be lopsided. Maybe the pattern doesn't set up at all. Again, we get a big recovery and a big rebound back up here to the 20,400 area. This is suggesting one more leg down scenario is probably going to play out. Warned you about the divergence back up at the top with momentum and the RSI and other signals, daily time frame like the RSI in the daily and on the intraday charts, and those signals have played out, giving us a sell-off. The NASDAQ and the S&P 500. The thing with the S&P, again, I told you we were either going to try to bottom around the 200 or come down and get another leg down and hit this trend line. This beautiful channel we have on the S&P 500. Again, rolled over today, so I think that we're going to go down. Now, again, it could be that we just go back and fill the gap, get a higher low and diverge with the S&P, or again, like I said, we could come down, hit this trend line, or even move beyond it and reshape the trend line. That's possible. But again, whether we just go back and fill the gap and get a higher low and test the 200 or hit this level, I'll be watching. Go beyond the trend line here just a little bit. You have this horizontal support just underneath it here around the 5450 area. So just some levels to be watching. But S&P got the gap at the very top. It could still end up coming back up and making a new high. Well, NASDAQ eventually goes back and fills the gap at 20,400 at some point in the near future. But right now, I think we're going to get more volatility. This is suggesting that. The NASDAQ's going to push to new lows. We'll see if we hit this up lower boundary of the channel or the 200 again here with the S&P 60-minute chart. Just a quick recap here. We had this bullish falling wedge. I told you about that 3 sessions ago. We broke out and we back tested, and I told you bullish falling wedge. It was right at the 200 on the 60-minute chart that we can attempt a counter trend rally. Gapped higher. We're probably going to go fill this gap before the weekends and the next 2 sessions in all likelihood. But we rallied up and we formed this rising wedge. And again, this trend line right here, we kept pushing into it. And here we had a little bit of a pullback to the 50. And then we pushed up and we formed this large divergence. And again, broke the trend line of the rising wedge, this upper boundary right here, and this right here. As a lower boundary, and then we broke down and we went sideways, and you got a possible head and shoulders here on the 5-minute chart. We rallied back up to the 50, got rejection, bounced off the 200, breaking down from the pattern. So again, if we go lower in the next day or two, I'll be watching the gap fill down here. I'll be watching the lows right here on the S&P. Again, NASDAQ is likely going to move lower. S&P may just fill the gap and get a higher low. We'll be watching to see which way it plays out. But underneath this low, you do have that lower channel line that I've been talking about. But a nice looking head and shoulders developing after the breakdown of a rising wedge with today's price action. S&P 5-minute chart. See the rising wedge into towards the 200, didn't quite reach it. And then we had this trend line right here as well. And we had the negative divergence there that gave us the breakdown of the rising wedge on the 15-minute chart. Negative divergence here on the MACD. Pushing slightly negative on the MACD and went below 50 on the RSI. So again, we could see a bigger drop to come back and fill this gap. And then we'll see if we move to a new low on the S&P. I think NASDAQ will move to a new low. Signals remain bearish, and this is likely a counter trend. Eventually, I think we come back and fill this gap. You can see it on the 15-minute chart. We closed right here, and then we gapped lower the next day. So eventually, I think we're coming back to fill this gap. My guess is we're probably going to fill this one first. We'll see if we move to a new low. But eventually, surrounding the Fed, I think the S&P will probably push to a new high. I think the earnings, as I should say as well, or just after the Fed with more earnings. But I do think that the NASDAQ will eventually fill the gap below, and then at 19,210 or so, go back and fill the gap at 20,400. NASDAQ and S&P, we'll see if this moves to a new low or not with their bullish falling wedge here. Predicted that would give us a bounce in all likelihood off that 200 on the 60-minute chart, and it did. Momentum here rolling over. Again, we had this little divergence down here that gave us the bounce. Let me show you the RSI. And again, I think we're going to come back down and likely, again, test the levels I talked about here, and maybe move down to extremes, or maybe get a larger divergence. And just one other thing, I have this other trend line. I have the shadow at the red trend line for the channel, and the black trend line we bounced off of, but excluding the shadow. If we just come back and we get a higher low, fill the gap on the S&P, we could just bounce off that level and do that. If S&P gets a higher low, but NASDAQ moves to a lower low, we'll be watching. But we could hit this trend line as well. So again, if we form a divergence on the S&P and get another dump down, you could see a divergence develop on the RSI and down on the MACD as well here. And the MACD, it can confirm a higher low or a lower low. We'll be watching, but we're right at the center line. I think it's going to roll over, and you're going to either get your higher low, hit this trend line in the 200 again, or you're going to come down to this trend line, or maybe beyond it to the horizontal support level that I mentioned here. Actually, I didn't draw that very straight, a little bit lower. into that 5450 area. So again, I'll be watching for a divergence to develop or confirmation of a higher low on the S&P. I'll be watching for a triple bullish divergence to likely form on the NASDAQ 60-minute chart. It is up close. Again, I talked about this chart, the bullish falling wedge, and again, the bounce off the 200. Here we are coming up to the 50 and stalling. So again, we'll see. We have that little miniature head and shoulders on the 5-minute. If we start breaking down the momentum line, the momentum cloud, and the 20 period here, again, then we'll be watching, does a gap just fill, or do we come down here to this level right here? And again, maybe hit that other trend line that I talked about. Again, the diversions possibly forming on the RSI and down here on the MACD. S&P 60-minute chart.